Light snow moved softly across the fields of Raven Creek. A United States Marine worked in silence beside the greenhouse while his retired German Shepherd canine rested near his boots. He hadn't expected anyone to come this far anymore. Then near the gate, an old woman appeared. She stood beneath the falling snow holding a small worn suitcase, her gray coat moving gently in the cold wind. She didn't look lost, just tired. "I can still work," she said. "Just let me stay out of the cold tonight." The Marine looked at her for a long moment. Then at the empty road behind her. For a second he almost told her to leave, but beside him the old canine slowly stood up and walked straight toward the woman. If this story stays with you, don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and watch until the very end. The last snow of March melted slowly across the hills outside Raven Creek, Oregon, leaving the fields soaked, gray, and silent beneath a cold evening wind. Roe Danner drove the final nail into the broken fence post and stepped back without satisfaction. The work never really ended on the farm. Something was always rotting, collapsing, leaking, or freezing over. Maybe that was why he stayed. Fixing things with his hands was easier than sitting alone with his thoughts. At 42, Roe looked older than most men his age. Years in the United States Marine Corps had carved sharp lines into his face and shoulders long before time did. He was tall and heavily built with broad shoulders that still carried the rigid posture of a Marine even after retirement. His dark brown hair had begun turning gray around the temples, usually hidden beneath a worn black cap. A rough beard shadow covered his jaw most days because he rarely cared enough to shave properly anymore. A pale scar disappeared beneath the collar of his Oliver shirt, disappearing across his shoulder from an explosion in Fallujah years ago. He spoke little, avoided town whenever possible, and trusted routines more than people. Beside him stood Maroro. The retired German Shepherd K9 was 8 years old now, his thick amber and black fur moving lightly in the cold wind. One ear carried a small tear from an old deployment injury, and faint white scars crossed the bridge of his muzzle. Morrow rarely barked without reason. His training had stripped unnecessary noise from him long ago. Even resting, the dog watched everything with quiet calculation, around strangers. He usually became still first, then dangerous. The farm itself sat alone against miles of open land. The barn leaned slightly from age. Old tools hung rusted along the outer walls, and the greenhouse behind the property had nearly disappeared beneath dead vines and dirty glass. Nothing about the place looked welcoming. Roe preferred it that way. He picked up his hammer again when Morrow suddenly froze. The shift was immediate, not barking, not growling, just stillness. Roe noticed it instantly because Marines learned to trust silence more than noise. Morrow's ears lifted toward the front gate. Roe turned slowly. At the far end of the dirt road, an old woman stood beside the wooden fence, unmoving beneath the fading evening light. She had probably been standing there longer than he realized. Roe narrowed his eyes slightly. Most people from Raven Creek never came this far into the valley unless something was wrong. The woman looked small against the wind. Her gray wool coat hung loosely over a thin frame, the fabric faded with age and years of use. One gloved hand rested over the handle of a weathered suitcase with cracked leather corners while the other held the fence rail lightly, more for balance than support. Strands of silver-white hair escaped from beneath a knitted brown cap, moving softly against her pale cheeks. She looked tired, not weak. There was a difference. When she finally stepped closer, Roe noticed the careful way she walked, measured and steady, like someone used to hiding pain from other people. Her face carried deep lines around the eyes and mouth, but her posture remained strangely dignified. The kind of dignity older people carried after surviving enough disappointments that embarrassment no longer mattered. Morrow moved first. The German Shepherd walked several feet ahead of Roe, body tense, ears forward, eyes locked on the stranger. The old woman stopped immediately. Smart. Most people either panicked or tried too hard to act fearless around military dogs. She did neither. Instead, she looked directly at Morrow and spoke softly. "Good boy." Her voice carried the roughness of age and cold weather, but there was calm inside it. Real calm, not nervous pretending. Roe watched carefully. Morrow usually circled strangers before deciding what they were. This time he didn't. The dog stopped directly in front of her, staring upward without blinking. Seconds passed. The wind moved through the fields. Then something happened Roe had never seen before around a stranger. Marrow slowly sat down beside the old woman, not guarded, not defensive, just beside her. Roe felt his grip tighten slightly around the hammer. "What do you want?" he finally asked. The woman looked toward him. Her blue-gray eyes were tired but sharp, the kind shaped by long years of watching people carefully before trusting them. "My name is Lenora Vale," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for money." Rose said nothing. Lenora glanced once toward the old barn beside the property. "I was wondering if there's a place inside your stable where I could stay tonight, just somewhere out of the wind." The answer should have been easy. No, that was always the safer answer. Roe had spent years building distance between himself and the rest of the world. Distance meant quiet, quiet meant control. People complicated things, people stayed too long, lied too easily, or eventually left anyway. But Marrow remained seated beside her. That bothered him more than it should have. Lenora adjusted her grip on the suitcase. "I can still work," she added after a moment. "I used to manage greenhouse gardens before my husband passed. If you need help fixing the soil behind the house, I can earn my stay." Roe almost refused again. Then he noticed her hands. Even beneath the gloves, he could see the stiffness in her fingers from arthritis. Her coat sleeves were slightly damp near the wrists from melted snow. She had probably been outside for hours. Still, she hadn't begged once. Marrow looked back toward briefly, waiting the same way he used to wait during deployments before entering dangerous buildings. Roe exhaled slowly through his nose. "You can use the room behind the kitchen," he muttered. "For a couple nights, that's it." Lenora's shoulders loosened slightly, though her expression barely changed. "Thank you." Roe walked toward the gate without another word and forced it open against the frozen mud beneath it. As Lenora stepped inside the property, Morrow immediately rose and walked beside her suitcase instead of ahead of it. Roe noticed that too. The three of them crossed the yard together beneath the fading Oregon sky, the farmhouse windows dark except for the weak yellow light above the kitchen sink. For the first time in years, someone other than Roe would sleep inside that house. And somehow that unsettled him more than the war ever had. Near the doorway, Lenora suddenly stopped. Her eyes moved briefly toward the abandoned greenhouse behind the barn, half hidden beneath dead vines and broken glass. A strange expression crossed her face. Not surprise, recognition. Then she quietly whispered something so softly Roe almost didn't hear it. Still standing after all this time, Roe frowned slightly. Before he could ask what she meant, Morrow let out a low sound deep in his throat and stared toward the darkness beyond the greenhouse like he sensed something neither human could see. Cold rain drifted across Raven Creek for 3 straight days, turning the dirt roads into dark rivers of mud beneath a sky the color of wet steel. By the 4th morning, Roe realized something about the farmhouse had changed. It wasn't louder. Lenora Vale moved too quietly for that, but the silence inside the house no longer felt abandoned. Small things had shifted without him noticing exactly when a clean towel hung beside the sink instead of across the chair. The old radio near the kitchen window worked again, filling the mornings with soft jazz from some station barely reaching the valley through static. Even the air smelled different now. Less dust, more coffee and cedarwood smoke. Roe didn't know how to feel about any of it. He stood on the back porch with a mug in one hand, watching Lenora move slowly through the greenhouse behind the barn. At 75, she worked carefully, never wasting movement. Her thin frame disappeared beneath a thick wool cardigan patched at both elbows, and her silver hair remained loosely pinned behind her head, despite the wind constantly pulling strands free. Arthritis stiffened her hands enough that she sometimes paused before gripping tools, but there was still precision in everything she touched. She wasn't rebuilding the greenhouse. She was waking it up. That was different. Most of the heavy repairs still belonged to Roe. He replaced broken wood panels, hauled rusted irrigation pipes from storage, and installed new support beams beneath sections of the sagging roof. Lenora simply directed him from inside among the rows of cracked planting beds and dead vines. Sometimes she carried old seed trays beneath one arm while explaining how the soil needed warmth before new roots would survive another Oregon frost. "You're planting too deep," she called gently. One morning, Roe glanced up from the dirt with mild irritation. "It's a seed, not a burial." Lenora smiled faintly without looking at him. "Exactly." Morrow lay beside the greenhouse entrance, watching both of them. The retired German Shepherd had developed a strange routine over the past week. Whenever Lenora worked inside the greenhouse, he positioned himself near the doorway like a silent guard. The old military instincts never really left him. Sometimes sudden noises still affected him badly. Twice already, nearby thunder had made his body tense hard enough that Ro noticed the trembling beneath his fur. During storms, Morrow usually isolated himself beneath the kitchen table until the shaking stopped. But around Lenora, something changed. The old woman never treated him like a weapon. She spoke to him the way people spoke to wounded soldiers after war, softly, without pity. That afternoon, while Ro repaired a shattered window panel above the greenhouse frame, Morrow suddenly rose and moved toward the old barn storage shed. Lenore noticed immediately. "He hears something?" she asked quietly. "Probably a rabbit," but Ro climbed down anyway. Morrow stood waiting beside the half-open shed door, staring into the darkness inside. The smell of cold dust and machine oil drifted outward. Ro stepped carefully through the clutter until he reached the back wall where old military storage trunks sat untouched beneath heavy tarps. One of them had been dragged slightly open. He frowned. "I didn't touch anything," Lenora said from behind him. Ro nodded once and crouched beside the trunk. Inside rested old photographs, Marine Corps paperwork, faded maps, and pieces of another life he rarely allowed himself to revisit. His fingers paused briefly over a burned military dog tag attached to a broken chain. Lenora's expression changed the moment she saw it, not shock, recognition. The metal was blackened along one edge from heat damage. A deep scratch crossed the name stamped into it, Ro Danner. Lenora stared a second too long before looking away. "You all right?" Ro asked. She blinked once, just tired, but Ro noticed something unsettled behind her eyes now, something distant. That night the rain became a storm. Wind slammed against the farmhouse hard enough to rattle the windows while thunder rolled through the valley like distant artillery fire. Around midnight, the electricity failed completely, dropping the house into darkness, except for the orange glow of the fireplace. Ro grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the equipment shed before the pipes froze. "I'll be back." Lenora looked up from the couch. "You shouldn't fix electrical lines during a storm." "I'm not fixing lines, just checking the generator." Morrow immediately stood and followed him outside. The rain hit like ice against Ro's face the moment he stepped into the yard. Wind bent the trees violently across the property while mud sucked against his boots with every step. He reached the generator shed and pulled the rusted metal door open just as another thunder crack split across the mountains. Morrow flinched hard. Ro saw it immediately. The dog's breathing changed, sharp and uneven now, old combat instincts dragging him somewhere far from Oregon. "It's all right," Ro muttered automatically. Then the generator slipped. The heavy metal panel slammed downward onto Ro's hand. Pain shot through his fingers instantly. "Damn it." Blood spread quickly across his knuckles. By the time he returned to the farmhouse, soaked and irritated, Lenora was already waiting beside the kitchen table with a lantern lit and medical supplies spread neatly beside it. "You keep iodine in your kitchen?" Ro asked. "You keep bandages in the wrong cabinet," she replied calmly. Ro sat reluctantly while she cleaned the wound. Her hands moved with practiced confidence despite the arthritis. She wrapped the gauze firmly but carefully checking circulation afterward without needing to think about it. Not hesitation, not guessing, training. Rose studied her quietly now. That's not greenhouse work. Lenora's movements slowed slightly. For a few seconds only rain filled the silence. Then she tied the bandage closed and leaned back in the chair. After a rock, she said softly, "I volunteered at a rehabilitation center near San Diego, mostly Marines." Her tired eyes lowered toward Rose's injured hand. "Young men learning how to walk again, some learning how to sleep again." Rose stayed still. The fire cracked softly nearby while thunder faded farther into the mountains. Lenora continued speaking, though quieter now. "Most people think war ends when soldiers come home." A faint sadness crossed her face. "That isn't true." Something in Rose's chest tightened unexpectedly because she sounded like someone who had seen it herself. Not from television. Not from stories from hallways filled with broken young men staring at ceilings at 3:00 in the morning because they were afraid to close their eyes. Morrow slowly crossed the room then and lowered himself beside Lenora's chair. Not beside Ro, beside her. The old woman rested one hand carefully against the German shepherd's neck while rain battered the windows around them. For the first time in years, the farmhouse no longer felt like a place waiting to die quietly in the dark. But as Ro watched Lenora beside the firelight, another thought slowly settled into his mind. Somewhere deep down, she already knew far more about him than she should. And he was beginning to suspect the greenhouse wasn't the only reason she stopped at his gate. Cold rain drifted across Raven Creek before sunrise, covering the valley and fog thick enough to swallow the distant mountains whole. Water slid down the old greenhouse glass in crooked lines while wind pushed softly against the farmhouse walls, carrying the smell of wet soil and cedar through the property. Inside the kitchen, the old radio beside the window played low jazz through static, while Lenora Vale carefully sorted packets of winter lettuce seeds beneath the warm yellow light above the sink. The farmhouse no longer felt abandoned now. There were signs of life everywhere. Fresh towels drying beside the stove, a kettle warming near the fire, muddy boots beside the back door that belonged to more than one person. Ro Danner noticed the black Cadillac the moment it appeared at the end of the road. The retired Marine stood near the porch, repairing a rusted lantern handle when Morrow abruptly lifted his head toward the gate. The German Shepherd had been asleep seconds earlier, stretched across the wooden floorboards with one scarred ear twitching softly beside the sound of rain. Now every muscle in the dog's body tightened beneath his thick amber and black fur. A low growl rolled deep through his chest, quiet enough that most people would miss it completely. Ro didn't. Years in the Marines had taught him one thing about military dogs. They usually sensed danger before people admitted it existed. The Cadillac stopped near the front fence. Inside the kitchen, Lenora froze before the engine even shut off. Ro looked toward her through the screen door and immediately saw the change in her face. The old woman's pale hands tightened around the seed packets hard enough to bend them. Her shoulders seemed smaller somehow, like age suddenly returned all at once after disappearing for weeks inside the quiet rhythm of the farm. "That him?" Ro asked. Lenora nodded once. "Silas." The man who stepped from the Cadillac looked like someone who belonged in city offices and expensive restaurants, not standing in mud beside an Oregon farm. Silas Gray was tall and sharply built, probably in his mid-40s, with narrow shoulders hidden beneath a dark charcoal overcoat tailored perfectly against his lean frame. His dark hair was slicked neatly backward despite the rain, streaked lightly with silver near the temples, and a trimmed layer of stubble sharpened the hard lines of his jaw. Everything about him looked controlled. Even his movements felt measured, practiced over years spent learning how to appear calm and respectable in every situation. But his eyes unsettled Ro immediately. They were cold, not angry, not emotional, just empty in the way certain ambitious men became after spending too long treating people like transactions. Silas opened a black umbrella before walking toward the porch. "Mother," he called softly, "I've been looking for you." Lenora said nothing. Marrow moved instantly. The German Shepherd stepped directly between Lenora and the porch stairs, body rigid, head lowered slightly, lips twitching once over his teeth. He didn't bark. That made the moment worse. Dogs like Marrow barked when uncertain. Silence meant certainty. Silas stopped walking. For the first time since arriving, his expression shifted slightly, nervous only for a second. Then the polished smile returned. "You must be Mr. Danner," he said, glancing toward Ro. "Thank you for helping her. I know she can be difficult sometimes." Ro leaned one shoulder against the porch post without answering immediately. Rain tapped softly against the metal roof above them while cold wind pushed through the fields behind the barn. "She asked for a place out of the cold," Ro finally said. Silas nodded slowly like a man trying to remain patient with a complicated situation. "Lenora hasn't been herself since my stepfather passed away. After the funeral, her memory started getting worse, confusion wandering," he sighed quietly. "A month ago, she disappeared from a care facility in Medford. I walked out," Lenora answered sharply from behind Morrow. Silas ignored her. The doctors were worried about her mental state. Lenora laughed softly then, but there was no humor in it. "Funny how I only became mentally unstable after you discovered lithium beneath our family land." The silence afterward felt heavier than the rain. Silas slowly removed a leather folder from inside his coat. "I have temporary guardianship authorization through Maricopa County." His voice remained calm, professional, almost gentle. "Legally, I'm responsible for her well-being." Ro still didn't take the papers. Instead, he watched Morrow. The dog had not stopped staring at Silas once since he arrived. That bothered him a lot. Lenora stepped forward carefully, one hand resting against the porch railing. At 75, she still carried herself with quiet dignity despite the stiffness in her joints and the exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes. "Tell him the truth," she said quietly. "Tell him why you really came." Silas's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "He's trying to sell my grandfather's land in Arizona," Lenora continued. "When I refused, he convinced a court I wasn't mentally fit to manage my own finances anymore." Her tired blue-gray eyes shifted briefly toward Ro. "3 months later, I was locked inside a care facility while he started moving money through the family trust." "That's not what happened," Silas replied immediately, though some of the calmness had disappeared from his voice. "Now out at 75 years old, I was gardening," Lenora answered, "not dying." Morrow suddenly growled louder. Another vehicle approached through the mud. A sheriff truck. Deputy Aaron Pike climbed out, adjusting his rain jacket against the cold wind. He was a broad, heavy-set man near 50 with tired eyes and thinning blonde hair hidden beneath a weathered sheriff hat. Unlike Silas, Pike immediately looked uncomfortable, like someone already regretting the call he was responding to. "We received a welfare concern regarding Ms. Vale," Pike explained carefully. "From him?" Lenora asked. The deputy avoided the question. Silas stepped forward slightly. "My mother isn't mentally stable enough to make good decisions right now." Morrow barked once, sharp, violent. Silas instantly stopped moving. Deputy Pike looked down at the dog nervously. "Ma'am, are you staying here willingly?" "Yes." "Do you feel threatened?" "No." "Is Mr. Danner forcing you to remain here?" Lenora looked directly at Silas. "The only person trying to force anything is my son." Rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof while silence settled over everyone again. Then Lenora quietly added the sentence that changed the entire atmosphere. "He hid the lithium reports from the family trust." This time even Deputy Pike looked surprised. Silas froze only briefly, but Rose saw it, that flash of panic behind the polished businessman mask. And suddenly the Marine understood everything. This was never about protecting an elderly woman. This was about money, a fortune hidden beneath empty desert land. Silas slowly closed the folder beneath his arm. His polite smile returned, colder than before. "This conversation isn't over." "No," Ro answered quietly. "Guess it isn't." Silas stared at him another long moment before turning back toward the Cadillac. But before getting inside, he glanced once toward the greenhouse behind the barn and smiled slightly, not angry, calculating. That night, long after the rain stopped, Rose stood alone beside the kitchen window while jazz music drifted softly through the farmhouse from the old radio. Lenora sat near the fire with one hand resting against Morrow's neck, while the retired canine watched the darkness outside with alert eyes that refused to close. Because somehow the dog already knew what Ro was only beginning to realize. Men like Silas Gray didn't walk away after hearing no. Morning fog rolled heavily across Raven Creek, covering the valley in pale gray mist while cold water dripped steadily from the pine trees surrounding the farm. The storm from the previous night had passed, but the property still carried its weight. Mud covered the yard. The greenhouse windows were streaked with rainwater, and the old barn roof creaked softly whenever wind moved through the hills. Inside the greenhouse, however, life continued, returning little by little. Small rows of green shoots pushed carefully through dark soil beneath weak morning sunlight, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the low jazz music drifting from the kitchen radio nearby. Ro Danner stood near the back, worked repairing a damaged heater valve while Morrow rested close to the greenhouse entrance. The retired German shepherd appeared calm at first glance, but his ears still twitched toward every distant sound outside the property. Ever since Silas arrived at the farm, the dog rarely relaxed completely anymore. Lenora Vale sat nearby, sorting through old folders and documents spread carefully across the wooden table. At 75, she moved slower than before the storm, her thin hands stiff from arthritis as she adjusted papers beneath the warm greenhouse light. Strands of silver-white hair had escaped her loose braid again, resting softly against the pale lines of her face. She looked tired this morning, not physically, emotionally. For several minutes, only the sound of turning pages filled the greenhouse. Then Lenora suddenly stopped moving. Ro noticed immediately. The old woman stared silently at something inside one of the folders, her expression distant now, almost unsettled. Morrow lifted his head at the exact same moment. "What is it?" Ro asked. Lenora didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly pulled a photograph from the folder and placed it carefully on the table between them. Ro looked down. The picture was old and slightly faded around the corners. Several volunteers stood outside a military rehabilitation hospital beneath bright California sunlight, most wearing pale blue scrubs and tired smiles. But Ro barely noticed them because near the center of the photograph stood a young Marine covered in bandages, thin, unshaven, one arm locked in a sling, bruises covering half his face beneath hospital light. Ro stared at the image without speaking. Something cold moved quietly through his chest. "That was San Diego," Lenora said softly after a long silence. "Naval Medical Center, spring of 2007. Rose slowly lowered himself into the chair beside the table, eyes still fixed on the photograph. Fragments of memory drifted back slowly through the fog inside his head. Hospital ceilings, morphine, machines beeping during sleepless nights. Marines learning how to walk again beside endless white hallways that smelled like antiseptic and burned skin. "I don't remember this," he admitted quietly. "You weren't awake for most of it." Lenora folded her hands together carefully. "After Fallujah, they transferred dozens of injured Marines through the rehabilitation unit where I volunteered. Some stayed weeks, some stayed months." Her tired eyes lowered briefly toward the picture. "You stayed longer." The greenhouse suddenly felt strangely quiet around him. Ro leaned back slightly, rubbing one hand across the scar near his shoulder beneath the fabric of his thermal shirt. "You knew who I was this whole time?" Lenora shook her head gently. "Not at first." A faint smile crossed her face, sad more than warm. "Time changes people. War changes them even more." Morrow slowly rose and moved closer beside her chair. Lenora rested one hand lightly against the dog's neck before continuing. "The night you injured your hand fixing the generator, I saw the burned scar on your shoulder while wrapping the bandage. Then I noticed your dog tag hanging near the kitchen shelf." Her eyes returned to him again. "That's when I recognized you." Ro looked back down at the photograph. "You should have said something. I didn't want you feeling like you owed me gratitude." Lenora answered softly. "Broken soldiers already carry enough weight." Those words stayed with him longer than he expected. Before Ro could answer, the sound of tires crunching through wet gravel echoed outside the greenhouse. Morrow reacted instantly. The German shepherd moved toward the door with a deep growl building low in his chest. Another vehicle had entered the property. Rose stepped outside just as a silver SUV stopped beside the farmhouse. Silas Gray climbed out first, dressed in another expensive dark coat despite the mud covering the yard, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman stepped out beside him, carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm. Patricia Whine looked somewhere in her early 40s, tall and sharply built with blonde hair tied tightly behind her head and pale skin untouched by outdoor work or sunlight. Everything about her appearance felt severe. Her posture, narrow eyes, and clipped movements all carried the cold confidence of someone used to courtrooms and legal threats. Behind them came another woman wearing a county identification badge attached to a gray jacket. Dana Mercer, an adult protective services worker, appeared calmer than Patricia. Though exhaustion rested heavily beneath her eyes, she looked like someone who had spent too many years dealing with family disputes that never truly belonged to her. Silas approached the porch slowly. "Mother," he said, voice controlled again, "I'm giving you one more opportunity to leave peacefully." Lenora stepped beside Ro without hesitation now. "No." Patricia opened the briefcase immediately. "Mail, your son has legal authority to request an emergency evaluation regarding your mental competency." Ro crossed his arms. "And what exactly made him decide she's incompetent?" Lenora answered before anyone else could. "Because I refused to sell my land." Silas's jaw tightened. Dana Mercer looked carefully between them. Unlike the others, she actually observed the details around the property. The organized greenhouse, the repaired farmhouse, the old woman standing steadily on her own feet. "Ms. Vale," Dana asked gently, "are you staying here voluntarily?" "Yes." "Has anyone threatened or manipulated you into remaining here?" Lenora almost smiled. That man barely talks enough to manipulate anybody. Even Dana's expression softened slightly. Silas stepped forward suddenly. "She's confused. She hides documents, forgets medication, and refuses medical supervision." "I kept copies of your transactions," Lenora replied quietly. The hidden lithium reports too. Silas froze. Patricia looked toward him sharply. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Then Silas grabbed Lenora's arm. Enough. Morrow exploded forward instantly. The German shepherd lunged between them with a violent bark that shook the porch itself. His teeth flashed inches from Silas's face while deep growls rolled through the cold air. Silas stumbled backward immediately, slipping against the wet porch steps as Dana instinctively stepped away in shock. Morrow planted himself directly in front of Lenora without moving another inch. And for the first time since arriving at the farm, Silas looked genuinely afraid. Spring returned slowly to Raven Creek after the investigation began against Silas Gray and the mining company connected to him. Snow disappeared from the hills first, then the frozen mud softened beneath steady rain, and finally small patches of green started spreading across the valley again. The old farm looked different now, not newer, alive. The greenhouse behind the barn no longer stood dark and abandoned beneath broken vines. Warm yellow light glowed through the repaired windows each evening, shining softly across the wet fields like a lantern left burning for people still trying to find their way home. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Once Adult Protective Services started reviewing Lenora Vale's financial records, other things surfaced quickly. Hidden transfers, forged signatures, shell companies tied to mineral contracts in Arizona. Silas disappeared from Raven Creek less than 2 weeks after the county froze several of his business accounts. Nobody in town seemed surprised. Men like him rarely stayed once lawyers and investigators started asking real questions. Lenora received full control of her property back by early April. When the official documents arrived in the mail, she barely reacted at all. The old woman simply folded the papers carefully and placed them inside the kitchen drawer beside the radio. Roe noticed that years earlier, he would have expected celebration, relief, maybe anger after everything Silas had done, but Lenora carried hardship differently. At 75, she understood something younger people often didn't. Peace mattered more than revenge. The farm changed steadily after that, not all at once, little by little. The greenhouse became the center of everything first. Rows of herbs and cold-weather vegetables slowly filled the planting beds again beneath the repaired glass ceiling. Lavender hung drying beside the windows. Tomato vines climbed carefully rebuilt wooden frames. The smell of damp soil and growing plants drifted through the property from morning until night. Lenora spent hours there every day despite the pain in her hands. Teaching Roe how to trim dead roots properly or rotate seedlings so they reach sunlight evenly. "You can't force living things to heal faster," she told him one afternoon while carefully replanting rosemary into a larger pot. "You just give them the conditions to survive." Roe quietly realized she wasn't only talking about plants. More veterans started arriving by summer. Not many at first, just 1 or 2 men from nearby counties who heard rumors about the old Marine living outside Raven Creek with a retired military dog and a greenhouse full of quiet conversations. Most came carrying the same look Roe once had when Lenora first arrived at the gate, exhaustion hidden beneath silence. One of the first was Daniel Mercer, a former Army medic in his early 30s with dark skin weathered by too much sun and deep circles beneath constantly restless eyes. Daniel spoke politely but rarely looked directly at people for long. Years earlier, an IED explosion outside Kandahar killed 2 soldiers he had tried unsuccessfully to save, and since then he struggled sleeping indoors without panic attacks. The first night he stayed at the farm, Morrow slept outside Daniel's room without being asked. Others followed later. A retired Navy corpsman named Elliot Vance arrived in late August driving an old pickup filled with veterinary supplies and 2 injured rescue dogs from Portland shelters. Elliot was nearly 60, broad-shouldered with a gray beard and rough hands permanently stained by years of animal medicine. He laughed easily but carried sadness behind his eyes whenever military funerals were mentioned. Within days, he converted part of the barn into a small treatment room for retired working dogs that nobody else wanted anymore. The farm slowly became something none of them originally planned. Not a business, not charity, something quieter, a place where damaged people stopped pretending they were fine. Roe repaired the empty horse stalls into sleeping quarters, while Lenora organized the greenhouse into small therapy spaces where veterans worked with soil, plants, and abandoned animals instead of sitting inside sterile offices answering questions from strangers with clipboards. Some men stayed days, others stayed months. A few simply disappeared again after resting long enough to remember how breathing felt without fear sitting permanently inside their chest. And through all of it, Morrow remained at the center somehow. The old German shepherd slowed with age by autumn. Gray spread heavily around his muzzle, and cold mornings made stiffness settle visibly into his back legs. But every afternoon, he still climbed onto the porch beside Leonard's rocking chair and rested there while she listened to jazz from the old radio. Sometimes she read quietly beside him. Other times, they simply watched the valley together beneath fading sunlight without speaking at all. Roe often watched them through the kitchen window. The strange thing was how normal it all felt now. Months earlier, the farmhouse had been silent enough that he could hear pipes creaking inside walls during the night. Now there was always something. Voices from the greenhouse, boots near the doorway, dogs sleeping beside the fireplace, coffee brewing before sunrise. Life. One evening near the beginning of winter, snow started falling again across Raven Creek. Roe stood outside alone beneath the porch roof while cold wind moved through the valley. The greenhouse glowed softly behind the barn, warm light shining through fogged windows while silhouettes moved inside among the plants. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed quietly near the fire pit beside the fence line. Behind him, the farmhouse windows glowed gold against the dark. Lenora sat inside beside the radio with Morrow resting at her feet, one hand absent-mindedly brushing the old dog's fur while jazz music drifted softly through the room. For a long moment, Roe simply stood there watching the light spill across the snow-covered yard. Years ago, after leaving the Marines, he believed isolation was the safest way to survive. If nobody entered your life, nobody could leave it behind in ruins. It had sounded logical at the time, simple, controlled. But standing there now, listening to distant voices inside the home that once held nothing except silence, he finally understood something else. Some people didn't enter your life because they needed saving. Sometimes they arrived to remind you that you were still allowed to come home, too. Snow continued falling softly across the valley while warm yellow light stretched outward from the farmhouse windows into the dark Oregon night. And all of it had started because one old wooden gate stayed open during a cold evening in March. Sometimes God doesn't change a life with miracles that shake the earth. Sometimes he works quietly through small moments. A gate left open on a cold night, a stranger given a second chance, or a lonely heart finally allowing someone inside again. We often think strength means carrying every burden alone, but maybe real healing begins when we choose kindness before fear and compassion before distance. Every day there are people around us silently fighting battles we cannot see. A kind word, a little patience, or simply refusing to turn someone away may become the very thing that helps them keep going. And sometimes the people we believe we are saving are actually the ones sent by God to help heal us too. If this story touched your heart in any way, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from or what part of the story stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about faith, healing, Marines, and loyal canine companions, don't forget to subscribe and stay with this channel for more journeys like this. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that no matter how difficult life becomes, there is always a place where light can return again.